On the morning of November 1st, 1755, the city of Lisbon shook apart during morning mass. 30,000 people died in the earthquake, the tsunami and the fires that followed, and across Europe, philosophers who had spent decades assuring humanity that we lived in the best of all possible worlds suddenly found themselves with nothing useful to say. This is the story of philosophy's oldest and most stubborn question. If a good God exists, why does the world contain so much suffering? We will trace this problem from ancient debates through medieval theology, examine the answers that satisfied some minds and tormented others, and discover why this question still matters even if you do not believe in God at all. The problem of evil has fractured religions, inspired elaborate theological systems, and challenged some of history's greatest minds. Augustine wrestled with it in the 4th century. Aquinas built systematic arguments around it in the 13th. Leibniz coined an entire word for it in 1710. Voltaire mocked every answer with savage humor. Hume dismantled the logic of divine goodness. Dostoevsky made it unbearably personal. And after Auschwitz, even those who had spent lifetimes defending God's justice found themselves without words. The question itself is deceptively simple. Around 300 years before the Common Era, the Greek philosopher Epicurus posed it in a form that still cuts. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? The logic forms a perfect trap. 3 divine attributes arranged like the points of a triangle that cannot hold. Omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness. Any two seem compatible with the existence of suffering. All 3 together appear impossible. Yet billions of people across thousands of years have believed in precisely this combination. And the question of how these attributes coexist with a world full of dying children and natural disasters has never found an answer that satisfies both logic and conscience. What makes the problem genuinely difficult is not the existence of minor inconveniences or necessary growing pains. Philosophers distinguish between moral evil, the suffering humans inflict on one another through cruelty or negligence, and natural evil, the suffering that comes from disease, disaster, the basic structure of a world governed by physics and biology. Moral evil might be explained through free will, though that explanation carries its own complications. But natural evil poses a harder challenge. The earthquake that buries children in rubble, the childhood cancer that consumes a 4-year-old who has done nothing to deserve it, the deer dying slowly in a forest fire with no humans present to witness, learn from, or be tested by its agony. These sufferings do not follow from human choice. They follow from the way the world is built, and if the world was built by an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good creator, then that creator chose to build it this way. This is not merely an intellectual puzzle, though it is certainly that. It is also a crisis of meaning, a confrontation with the possibility that the universe is indifferent to human suffering, or that the God who made it is something other than what theology claims. When Augustine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, he did so in part because he found a solution to this problem that satisfied him after years among the Manichaeans, who believed in 2 gods locked in eternal combat, one good and one evil. When Voltaire watched Europe's philosophers respond to the Lisbon earthquake with empty reassurances about divine providence, his fury produced a novel so sharp it destroyed centuries of optimistic theology. When Jewish theologians tried to make sense of the Holocaust, some concluded that traditional answers had become obscene, that continuing to defend God's goodness after the camps was itself a kind of blasphemy. But the problem does not belong only to believers. Secular versions of the same question haunt anyone who asks why the universe produces conscious beings capable of suffering, then fills their lives with undeserved pain. The atheist version of the problem is not about reconciling suffering with divine attributes, but about reconciling suffering with the need for life to mean something, for suffering to serve some purpose beyond itself. When you watch someone you love die badly slowly in confusion and fear, the question is not primarily about God's nature. The question is whether this means anything at all, whether the universe acknowledges what has been lost, whether there is any proportionality between what people endure and what they deserve. Philosophy has produced dozens of responses to the problem of evil over the centuries, each attempting to show how suffering and divine goodness might coexist. These responses have names: theodicy, defense, soul-making, the greater good argument, the free will defense, the privation theory. They range from the technical and abstract, using modern modal logic and possible world semantics, to the emotionally raw, cataloguing specific instances of child torture to ask what possible justification could make them worthwhile. Some of these responses are intellectually elegant, some are emotionally powerful. None has ever settled the question to everyone's satisfaction, and the persistence of the debate suggests something important. Perhaps it is not the kind of question that can be answered. Perhaps it is the kind of question that reveals what we believe about the world and ourselves in the way we ask it. Tonight we will move through this long history carefully. We will see how Augustine transformed evil from a substance into an absence, how Aquinas built elaborate architectures of divine permission, how Leibniz calculated that this world with all its horrors must be the best of all possible options. We will watch that confidence shatter beneath Lisbon and hear Voltaire's mockery echo through the ruins. We will follow Hume's cold logic as he turns every theodicy against itself, and we will sit with Ivan Karamazov as he explains why even a perfect theodicy would not be enough. We will see how the 20th century's nightmares changed what could be said about divine goodness, and we will trace the modern philosophical arguments that continue the debate with increasing technical sophistication. And at the end, we will ask what this question reveals about human beings and why we cannot seem to let it go. The problem of evil is many problems braided together: a logical contradiction, a pastoral crisis, a protest against injustice, a question about cosmic meaning. Every generation inherits it, and every generation must decide whether to defend the goodness of what is, or to insist that the world falls short of what should be. The question has no final answer waiting at the end of our journey, but in the asking, something important happens. We insist that suffering matters, that it requires acknowledgement, that the world as it is cannot be accepted without question. We are going to begin where the question itself began, in ancient Greece, with a philosopher who understood that the easiest questions sometimes lead to the hardest places. The problem begins with a question that sounds simple. If a deity exists who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why does the world contain suffering? The question is so direct that children ask versions of it. Why do bad things happen? If someone could stop them and knows they are happening, and cares that they are happening, why do they continue? In everyday life, if you watch a child drown when you could easily save them, we call that evil. If you know about a murder before it occurs, and do nothing to prevent it despite having the power to intervene, we hold you accountable. We apply these standards to human beings constantly. The problem of evil asks why they should not also apply to God. Epicurus, the Greek philosopher who lived from approximately 341 to 270 BCE, receives credit for the earliest clear formulation, though the exact words attributed to him come to us through later sources and may not be his precise phrasing. The structure of his challenge, however, has remained essentially unchanged for over 2,000 years. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? 4 possibilities, each one eliminating something essential from the traditional conception of divinity. Either power is missing, or goodness is missing, or knowledge is missing, or the entity in question does not deserve the title of God at all. The question arrives in the form of a logic puzzle, clean and sharp as geometry. What makes this a genuine philosophical problem rather than mere rhetoric is that it targets a very specific conception of the divine. Not all gods throughout history have been all-powerful. The deities of Greek mythology quarreled, made mistakes, found themselves constrained by fate. Zeus could not save Sarpedon from death, despite loving him. The gods of Norse mythology know they will die at Ragnarok and cannot prevent it. Many traditional religions feature gods with limited power, limited knowledge, or limited concern for human welfare. These gods do not generate the problem of evil in its classic form because they do not claim the combination of attributes that creates the logical tension. A god who lacks the power to prevent suffering is not responsible for failing to do so. A god who does not know about suffering cannot be blamed for ignoring it. A god who never claimed to be good in the first place cannot be accused of betraying that goodness. The problem emerges specifically within monotheistic traditions that insist on three attributes simultaneously: omnipotence, meaning unlimited power to act; omniscience, meaning complete knowledge of all facts including future events; and omnibenevolence, meaning perfect goodness that always wills what is best. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam each assert these characteristics as central to their understanding of God. Philosophy, working with these claims, asks how they fit together with observable reality. The world contains what appears to be pointless suffering. The world contains events that seem to serve no good purpose. If someone with unlimited power and knowledge and goodness governs reality, this combination of facts becomes difficult to explain. Philosophers distinguish between two categories of suffering when analyzing this problem. Moral evil refers to harm caused by the choices of free agents. Murder, theft, cruelty, oppression, all the ways human beings damage one another fall into this category. Moral evil seems, at least initially, easier to address within theology because it can be attributed to human free will rather than divine action. If God grants humans genuine freedom to choose, then humans can choose badly, and the resulting harm might be seen as the price of that freedom rather than something God directly causes. Whether that explanation actually works is a question we will examine in later chapters, but the structure of the response is at least clear. Humans do evil things. God permits this because freedom matters. The evil results from human choice, not divine will. Natural evil presents a harder case. Earthquakes kill thousands of people who made no choice to be in danger. Diseases destroy children who have done nothing to deserve suffering. Animals experience pain in the wild, torn apart by predators or dying slowly from injury or starvation, and they possess no moral agency that could justify their agony as a consequence of wrongdoing. A tsunami does not care about human virtue or vice. It simply moves according to the laws of physics, and if those laws produce waves that drown entire populations, that outcome seems difficult to attribute to free will. If God designed the natural world, then God designed a system that generates suffering independently of any moral choices. The child born with a degenerative disease that will cause years of pain before an early death has chosen nothing. The parents watching that child suffer have chosen nothing. The doctor unable to cure the condition has failed at nothing. Yet the suffering occurs built into the structure of biological reality. Natural evil asks why an all-powerful deity would create a world with these features. The problem functions as a logical challenge because it claims to identify an inconsistency in a set of beliefs. If you believe God is all-powerful, and you believe God is all-knowing, and you believe God is perfectly good, and you also believe evil exists, then you hold contradictory beliefs. Something in that set must be false. Either God lacks power, or lacks knowledge, or lacks goodness, or evil does not actually exist as we think it does. Logic permits no fifth option. The beliefs cannot all be true simultaneously. This is what philosophers call an inconsistency argument. It asserts that theism, defined as belief in an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God, contradicts observed facts about suffering in the world. If the argument succeeds, then anyone who wishes to maintain belief in such a God must either deny the existence of evil, redefine one of the divine attributes, or find some additional premise that resolves the apparent contradiction. You might notice that this entire problem rests on assumptions about what goodness means and what power requires. If a perfectly good being would never permit suffering under any circumstances, then the existence of suffering proves no such being governs reality. But what if that premise is false? What if goodness sometimes requires permitting short-term suffering for the sake of long-term benefit? What if certain goods can only be achieved through struggle, and a deity who prevented all difficulty would thereby prevent those goods? What if free will is so valuable that its existence justifies the risk of its misuse? What if we lack the knowledge to judge whether apparently pointless suffering actually serves hidden purposes? These questions represent the beginning of theodicy, the project of defending divine goodness against the challenge of evil. Every theodicy proposes some additional claim that, if accepted, breaks the apparent logical contradiction. The privation theory says evil is not a thing but an absence, so God did not create it. The free will defense says God permits evil because freedom requires it. The soul-making theodicy says suffering serves the purpose of moral and spiritual development. Each response adds something to the argument, trying to show that the original four beliefs are not actually inconsistent after all. But before we can evaluate these responses, we need to understand why the problem feels so urgent. Logic alone does not explain why this question has consumed so much philosophical energy over so many centuries. Plenty of logical puzzles exist that do not generate the same passionate investment. The problem of evil persists not merely as an intellectual exercise, but as an existential crisis, because it touches something deeper than consistency in a set of propositions. It asks whether the universe makes sense. It asks whether suffering means something or nothing. It asks whether trust in ultimate goodness can survive confrontation with actual horror. When a child dies in agony, the question is not primarily about whether four abstract beliefs fit together. The question is whether reality can be endured, whether there is any point to moral striving if the cosmos itself is indifferent or malevolent, whether hope is justified or foolish. The problem of evil begins as logic, but it lives as anguish. But logic alone has never satisfied human beings facing actual suffering. The question moved from Greek philosophy into the hands of people who believed the stakes were not intellectual but eternal. In the year 386, a man named Aurelius Augustinus sat weeping in a garden in Milan. He was 32 years old, a professor of rhetoric, and by all measures successful. He was also desperately unhappy. For 9 years he had been a Manichaean, a follower of the Persian prophet Mani, who taught that the universe was a battleground between two eternal principles, light and darkness, good and evil, locked in cosmic war. This doctrine had satisfied Augustine's intellect, because it seemed to explain the one thing that haunted him most: why the world contained so much suffering if God was good. The Manichaeans had an answer. God was good, but God was not alone. Evil was real, substantial, a force as ancient and powerful as goodness itself. The darkness was not God's fault. But Augustine had grown disillusioned. The Manichaean teachers could not answer his questions about astronomy and mathematics. Their mythology seemed increasingly crude. And there was something else, something harder to name. The doctrine felt too easy. It let God off the hook by splitting the universe in half, but it also meant that goodness could never fully triumph. The war between light and darkness had no end. Redemption was incomplete. Victory was impossible. Sitting in that Milanese garden, Augustine heard a child's voice from a neighboring house, singing or chanting, "Take up and read, take up and read." He opened a volume of Paul's letters and read a passage about putting aside the works of darkness. In that moment, as he would later describe in his Confessions, something shifted. He converted to Christianity, and with that conversion came a new question. If there was only one God, perfectly good and all-powerful, where did evil come from? The answer Augustine developed would reshape Western thought for more than a millennium. Evil, he concluded, was not a substance at all. It had no positive existence. It was privatio boni, the privation of good, the absence of what should be there. A shadow has no reality, apart from the object blocking light. Blindness is not a thing, but the absence of sight. Cold is not a substance, but the absence of heat. Evil, Augustine argued, worked the same way. It was a lack, a deficiency, a falling away from the good that God had created. This was a revolutionary move. If evil has no substance, then God did not create it. God created everything that exists, and everything God created was good. Evil entered the world not through divine action, but through the free choices of created beings who turned away from the good, the angels who became demons, the humans who fell in Eden. They were not introducing some foreign substance into creation. They were damaging what was already there, like rust corrupting iron or disease corrupting health. The elegance of this solution cannot be overstated. It preserved divine goodness completely. God never made evil, never wanted evil, never had evil as part of the plan. Every substance, every entity, every particle of being was created good and remains good insofar as it exists at all. When Augustine looked at the world, he saw a creation that was fundamentally, essentially, originally good. The suffering, the corruption, the horror, these were wounds in being, not parts of being itself. Free will became central to Augustine's theodicy because free will explained how privation was possible. God gave angels and humans the ability to choose, and that ability was itself good. A universe of mere automatons incapable of genuine choice would be less good than a universe containing free creatures. But freedom meant the possibility of turning away from God, who is the source and summit of all goodness. To turn away from the source of goodness is to diminish oneself, to become less than what one was meant to be. Sin is not the acquisition of something evil, but the loss of something good. The fall narrative made perfect sense within this framework. Adam and Eve were created good, placed in a world that was entirely good, given every good thing. Their sin was not forced upon them by some external evil power. They chose to disobey, and in that choice they introduced privation. They wounded their own nature. They lost the harmony they had possessed. The suffering that followed, the pain of childbirth and the sweat of labor and the inevitability of death, were all consequences of that self-inflicted damage. The world was not created broken. It became broken through misuse of freedom. Augustine's account satisfied medieval Christianity for centuries because it did several things simultaneously. It explained evil without compromising God. It preserved human moral responsibility. It made the narrative of salvation coherent. Christ came to restore what had been lost, to heal what had been wounded, to fill what had been emptied. Redemption was a return to an original goodness, not the creation of something entirely new. But there is something unsettling in Augustine's solution, something that becomes more apparent the longer you sit with it. If evil is merely absence, why does it feel so overwhelmingly present? When a child suffers, when a city burns, when violence tears through a community, it does not feel like the mere lack of something. It feels substantial, positive, real. To call suffering an absence seems to deny its weight, its force, its terrible immediacy. Augustine would respond that this is precisely the deception. Evil feels real because it damages real things. The pain is real because the body being harmed is real. The grief is real because the love being violated is real. Evil is parasitic on the good. It has power only because it destroys something genuine. A rusted sword is still mostly sword. The rust has no independent existence, but the damage it does is utterly concrete. Yet the problem remains. If God created everything that exists, and everything that exists is good, why is the world so thoroughly saturated with privation? Why is the absence so pervasive? Augustine's answer is that we live in a fallen world, a world marred by the cumulative weight of free choices turned away from God. Each act of sin adds another layer of damage, another degree of absence. The world we inhabit is not the world God intended. It is the world we have made through our refusal of goodness. This shifts the question but does not fully resolve it. For why would an omnipotent God permit the first act of turning away? Why allow the possibility of the fall? Augustine's response leads back to freedom. A world with free creatures capable of genuine love is better than a world without such creatures, even though freedom entails the risk of refusal. But this answer, however logically defensible, can feel cold when confronted with actual suffering. The parent watching a child die does not find comfort in being told that this agony is merely the absence of health, or that the world's capacity for such horror is the necessary price of human freedom. Medieval Christianity largely accepted Augustine's framework because it preserved what mattered most: the goodness of God, the reality of redemption, the hope that the damage could be undone. If evil is privation, then healing is possible. What has been emptied can be filled. What has been lost can be restored. The entire Christian story, from Genesis through Revelation, made sense within this structure. But the modern mind, formed by different pressures and asking different questions, struggles with Augustine's theodicy in ways medieval thinkers did not. We are more attuned to the sheer scale of suffering, more aware of natural disasters and diseases that seem to have nothing to do with human free will, more skeptical that all this pain can be explained as the consequence of ancient disobedience. The privation theory feels like a philosophical trick, a way of defining evil out of existence rather than genuinely accounting for it. Augustine's answer dominated Christian thought for 1,000 years, but it created as many puzzles as it solved. If evil is merely absence, why does suffering feel so terribly present? Augustine's answer dominated Christian thought for 1,000 years, but it created as many puzzles as it solved. If evil is merely absence, why does suffering feel so terribly present? A child screaming in pain does not seem to be experiencing a privation. A city destroyed by earthquake does not appear to be witnessing the subtraction of good. The philosophical elegance of Augustine's solution could not quite account for the weight of actual agony. By the 13th century, the question demanded someone willing to build a more comprehensive system, someone capable of absorbing not just scripture and church tradition, but the full force of Aristotelian logic that had recently flooded back into European universities through Arabic translations. That someone was Thomas Aquinas, and his approach would be so methodical, so relentlessly systematic, that even those who rejected his conclusions would have to admire the architecture of his thought. Thomas was born in 1225 in the Kingdom of Sicily, the youngest son of a noble family who expected him to become a respectable Benedictine abbot. Instead, he joined the Dominicans, a new order of wandering friars dedicated to preaching and study, and his family was so horrified they kidnapped him and held him captive for a year. He spent the time reading Aristotle. When they finally released him, he went to Paris and Cologne to study with Albertus Magnus, the greatest scholar of the age, who recognized immediately that his quiet, heavy-set student possessed one of the most formidable intellects Europe had produced. Thomas spent the rest of his life writing, teaching, and constructing vast theological systems with the patience of a cathedral builder. His masterwork, the Summa Theologica, remained unfinished at his death in 1274, but even incomplete it comprises millions of words organized into questions, articles, objections, and replies with a precision that makes modern academic writing look sloppy by comparison. The Summa addresses the problem of evil in several places, but most directly in the question of whether God is the cause of evil. Aquinas structures every article the same way. First, he lists objections to his own position, giving them their strongest possible formulation. Then he states his answer. Then he responds to each objection in turn, showing where it goes wrong or how it can be reconciled with his view. The method forces intellectual honesty. You cannot ignore counterarguments when you must state them clearly before presenting your own case. For the problem of evil, Aquinas presents objections that still sound contemporary. If God exists, then evil should not exist, because God is infinite goodness. If one of two contraries is infinite, the other is wholly destroyed. Therefore, if God exists, evil does not, but evil does exist. Therefore, God does not. Aquinas' response begins by accepting Augustine's framework. Evil has no positive existence. It is a privation of good, the way blindness is a privation of sight. But he pushes further, asking why God would permit such privations to exist at all. Here he imports Aristotelian metaphysics into Christian theology, with results that shaped Catholic doctrine for centuries. God permits evil, Aquinas argues, only when allowing it serves a greater good that could not be achieved otherwise. The universe God creates is not a collection of independent perfect things, but an ordered whole, a cosmos. in which different goods relate to each other in intricate hierarchies. Some goods require the existence of things that can fail, can decay, can fall short of their proper ends. The good of human freedom, for instance, requires that humans can choose wrongly. The good of courage requires danger to face. The good of mercy requires suffering to alleviate. Without the possibility of privation, certain excellences could not exist at all. This principle extends to natural evil, in ways Augustine never quite clarified. When a lion kills a gazelle, is that evil? Not in itself, Aquinas would say. The lion's nature requires predation. Its goodness consists partly in being an excellent predator. The gazelle's death is indeed a privation of that particular gazelle's good, but it serves the good of the lion and the good of the ecosystem as a whole. Nature operates according to patterns, according to what Aristotle called formal and final causes, and these patterns sometimes produce individual suffering in service of broader order. Fire burns, rivers flood, bodies decay. These are not failures of divine power, but consequences of a universe that operates according to consistent natural principles, and such consistency is itself a great good. A world where fire sometimes burned and sometimes did not, where gravity sometimes worked and sometimes failed, would be chaotic and uninhabitable. The regular order of nature permits life to exist at all, even though that same order guarantees that earthquakes will sometimes destroy cities and diseases will sometimes ravage populations. For moral evil, the evil humans inflict through choice, Aquinas follows Augustine in locating the source in free will, but he adds layers of distinction about how God relates to human action. God as first cause makes possible every action, including sinful ones, but God causes only the being and the power in an act, not its defect. When a person lies, God causes the speaking, the movement of tongue and breath, but not the falsehood that makes the speech a lie. The defect, the turning away from truth, comes from the human will alone. This allows Aquinas to preserve divine sovereignty while locating moral responsibility firmly in human choice. He addresses the question of why God does not simply prevent sin by overriding human will, and his answer is stark. Because a universe of free creatures who sometimes choose wrongly is better than a universe of puppets who cannot. The good of freedom outweighs the evil of its misuse. The system possesses genuine intellectual power. Each piece fits with mechanical precision into every other piece. God's omnipotence is preserved because God can do all things that are logically possible, and a free creature who cannot choose evil is a logical contradiction like a square circle. God's goodness is preserved because every permission of evil serves a greater good. God's omniscience is preserved because God knows all possibilities and has chosen the best arrangement of actual goods and permitted evils. Aquinas answers objections from every angle, showing how apparent contradictions dissolve under careful analysis. The Summa treats the problem of evil the way Euclid treats geometry, as a matter of proving theorems from axioms using strict logical rules. And yet, reading Aquinas inspires a peculiar combination of admiration and unease. The structure is beautiful, but it is the beauty of a fortress, and inside that fortress are human beings in terrible pain, whom the system has categorized and explained and filed under the appropriate headings of permitted privations serving greater goods. The child dying of cancer is part of the natural order. The woman tortured by a tyrant exercises free will in her response to suffering, and her torturer exercises free will in inflicting it, and God permits both for goods we may not see but must trust exist. The logical elegance does not make the screaming stop. Aquinas himself knew this, in a way, late in his life, while saying Mass. He experienced something he never explained, some vision or revelation that made him stop writing entirely. When urged to finish the Summa, he said everything he had written seemed like straw compared to what he had seen. He died 3 months later. We do not know what he saw, but perhaps he glimpsed something that all his careful distinctions and systematic theodicy could not capture. Some reality that made his thousands of pages feel suddenly inadequate. The Thomistic answer satisfied many minds for many centuries. It still satisfies some today. The Catholic Church made Aquinas a saint and a doctor of the Church, and his theology remains foundational to Catholic teaching. But the question refused to stay answered. Each generation found the system less convincing, not because the logic failed, but because the distance between logical consistency and human experience grew harder to ignore. You can prove that God permits your suffering for a greater good. You cannot make the greater good visible to someone buried in rubble or watching a loved one die slowly. The gap between theodicy and tragedy never quite closed. But what greater good could possibly justify a child's suffering? What cosmic plan makes the torture of innocence a reasonable price? These questions waited centuries for a philosopher bold enough to claim he had the answer. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz believed the universe operated like a perfect clock, and he had spent much of his life proving it. Born in Leipzig in 1646, he was the sort of mind that appears perhaps once in a century, a mathematician who invented calculus independently of Newton, a logician who dreamed of a universal symbolic language, a diplomat who tried to convince Louis XIV to conquer Egypt instead of Germany, a philosopher who thought he could reconcile science and religion through pure reason. He corresponded with everyone who mattered in European intellectual life, switching between Latin, French and German with equal facility, always hunting for patterns, always certain that beneath the apparent chaos of existence lay elegant mathematical necessity. When he turned his formidable intellect toward the problem of evil in 1710, publishing his Theodicy, essays on the goodness of God, the freedom of man and the origin of evil, he was convinced he could solve what had baffled Augustine and Aquinas. More than that, he invented the very word theodicy, from the Greek theos and dike, meaning the justice of God. The title announced his ambition. He would justify God to humanity using the tools of logic. The foundation of everything Leibniz built was a principle he called sufficient reason. Nothing happens without a reason why it happens rather than not. Nothing exists without a reason for its existence rather than non-existence. This was not mere common sense, but a profound metaphysical claim. The universe was not arbitrary, not random, not shot through with brute facts that simply were because they were. Every truth, no matter how small, had an explanation. Even God operated according to reason, not as a constraint on divine freedom, but as an expression of divine nature. God was perfect rationality itself. When God chose to create a universe, that choice had to have a sufficient reason. And what reason could a perfect being have for creating anything? Only this, to bring into existence the best possible creation. But what did best mean? Here Leibniz deployed a conceptual tool that would echo through philosophy for centuries: possible worlds. Before God created anything, an infinity of possible universes existed as pure ideas in the divine mind. Each was internally consistent, each obeyed its own natural laws, each contained different configurations of matter and different sequences of events. Some possible worlds contained no suffering at all, populated by beings who lacked free will and lived in perfect harmony with no capacity for choice or growth. Some contained different natural laws, where fire did not burn or gravity did not pull. Some contained conscious beings, some did not. Some lasted an instant, some endured for eternity. All were possible, meaning none contained logical contradictions. God surveyed this infinite array and chose one to actualize. The question became, by what criterion did God choose? Only one criterion made sense for a perfect being. God chose the best possible world, not a good world, not a better world than most alternatives, but the absolute best among all logical possibilities. This was not arbitrary preference, but mathematical necessity. A perfect God could not choose anything less than the optimum, and therefore the world we inhabit, with all its suffering and injustice and pain, must be that optimal creation. Any other world would have been worse overall. This was Leibniz's central claim, the proposition that would make him famous and then notorious: we live in the best of all possible worlds. The phrase sounds absurd on first hearing, almost obscene. A world with war and disease and children dying is the best possible, but Leibniz did not mean best in some naive sense of maximally pleasant or free from difficulty. He meant best in a complex calculation involving multiple competing goods. A world with free will was better than one without, even though free will made evil possible. A world with natural laws was better than one where miracles constantly intervened, even though natural laws meant earthquakes and floods. A world with growth and development was better than static perfection, even though growth required imperfection to grow from. The best possible world was not the world with the most happiness or the least suffering measured in raw quantities. It was the world with the greatest variety of goods balanced against the least necessary evil, the richest possible tapestry of being. Leibniz distinguished carefully between what God wills and what God permits. God wills the good directly, as an end in itself. God permits evil, never wills it, because eliminating that particular evil would require eliminating some greater good or introducing some worse evil. Every evil in the world served some purpose in the larger system, like a shadow that made light visible or a discord that resolved into harmony. Remove any piece, and the whole would be diminished, not because God needed evil, but because the alternatives were worse. Even God, with infinite power, could not create a world with free will, but no possibility of sin, or natural laws but no natural disasters, or growth but no imperfection. These combinations were logical contradictions, and not even omnipotence could make contradictions real. The principle of sufficient reason demanded that there be a reason why this particular universe existed rather than some other. The reason was that this one was optimal, but this created a tension in Leibniz's system that he never fully resolved. If God was constrained to choose the best possible world by divine nature, was God truly free? Leibniz said yes, because God chose according to reason rather than arbitrary caprice, and rational choice was the highest form of freedom. But critics saw a God bound by logical necessity, unable to create any world except this one, which seemed to limit divine sovereignty as surely as any external constraint. Still, the system possessed undeniable elegance. Leibniz had transformed the problem of evil from an emotional crisis into a mathematical proof. God creates the optimal solution from an infinite set of possibilities, balancing variables according to rational principles. Every element serves the whole. Nothing is wasted, nothing arbitrary. The universe operates with the precision of a perfect mechanism, every gear necessary, every movement calculated. It was Enlightenment philosophy at its most confident, the conviction that reason could explain everything, that complexity resolved into order, that behind apparent chaos lay exquisite design. Leibniz died in 1716, bitter and largely forgotten. His employer, the Elector of Hanover, had become King George I of England and left Germany without him. His priority dispute with Newton over calculus had turned acrimonious. His grand philosophical system attracted fewer adherents than he hoped, but his theodicy found an audience among those who wanted to believe that despite everything, the world made sense. For decades after his death, his argument circulated through European salons and universities. Philosophers quoted him, theologians adapted him, educated people invoked him when confronting suffering. The phrase "the best of all possible worlds" became shorthand for a particular kind of optimism, the belief that Providence ordered everything for ultimate good even when immediate appearances suggested otherwise. The system satisfied a particular historical moment, when Enlightenment reason seemed capable of penetrating every mystery, when the universe appeared increasingly lawful and comprehensible, when science revealed elegant mathematical patterns underlying natural phenomena. If Newton could reduce planetary motion to equations, why could Leibniz not reduce theodicy to logic? Both expressed the same faith, that reality was fundamentally rational, that everything had its place and purpose, that sufficient intelligence could grasp the why behind everything that happened. Leibniz offered what an age hungry for certainty craved, a proof that suffering was not meaningless, that evil served good, that God calculated perfectly. For decades, Leibniz's answer satisfied many of Europe's finest minds, and then, on a quiet November morning, the ground beneath Lisbon began to move. The morning of November 1st, 1755, broke clear and calm over Lisbon. It was All Saints' Day, and the churches filled early. Portugal's capital had grown wealthy on Brazilian gold and Asian spices, a city of broad plazas and baroque churches, of merchants and missionaries, of Enlightenment confidence built on imperial wealth. By 9:30 that morning, thousands knelt in prayer across dozens of churches. The ground beneath them had been stable for centuries. They had no reason to expect what came next. The first shock hit at 9:40. The earth moved in waves, violent enough to collapse buildings across the city centre. Church walls folded inward on congregations mid-prayer. The royal palace crumbled. Fissures opened in the streets. Survivors stumbled toward the waterfront, away from falling masonry and the screams of the trapped. They gathered at the docks, in the open space near the Tagus River, believing themselves safe. Then the water pulled back. The tsunami struck in 3 waves, each higher than the last, reaching perhaps 15 meters at their peak. The sea swept through the lower city, drowning thousands who had survived the earthquake itself. It carried ships inland and deposited them in city squares. It pulled survivors back into the churning water as it retreated, and then the fires began. Candles from morning mass had fallen into wreckage. Cooking fires had spread to collapsed timber. The blazes merged into a firestorm that burned for 6 days, consuming what the earthquake and tsunami had left standing. When the smoke cleared, between 30,000 and 60,000 people were dead, a quarter of the city's population, on All Saints' Day, during morning prayers. The news reached the rest of Europe in waves, each report more devastating than the last. This was not some distant catastrophe in an unfamiliar land. Lisbon was a major European capital, a centre of trade and culture. It had been, by all accounts, no more wicked than Paris or London or Vienna. If anything, its destruction during Mass on a holy day seemed to suggest either divine malice or divine indifference. Neither possibility fit comfortably into Enlightenment philosophy. For decades, Leibniz's optimism had provided intellectual comfort. Yes, suffering existed, but it served larger purposes in the best possible cosmic arrangement. Natural evil contributed to the order of nature. Moral evil emerged from the necessary gift of free will. Everything fit into a rational system, explicable to patient reason. The philosophers who had embraced this framework now found themselves offering explanations that sounded obscene. Some claimed Lisbon's destruction served as punishment for Portuguese sins. Others suggested the earthquake contributed to necessary geological processes, as though 30,000 deaths were justified by tectonic education. Others fell silent, recognizing that no response they could offer would satisfy anyone, least of all themselves. François-Marie Arouet, who wrote under the name Voltaire, was 61 years old when Lisbon shook apart. He had spent decades as Europe's most famous intellectual, celebrated for his wit, feared for his satire, frequently exiled for his irreverence. He had corresponded with Leibniz's followers, had absorbed Enlightenment optimism, had believed in progress and reason, and the possibility of human improvement. The Lisbon earthquake hit him like a personal assault. Within weeks he composed his poem on the Lisbon disaster, 2,400 lines of grief and rage. The poem abandoned the polite detachment of philosophical discourse. Voltaire demanded to know what crime these victims had committed, what sin justified crushing children in church. He attacked the philosophers of optimism directly, naming no names but making his targets unmistakable. All is well, you say. Come look at these appalling ruins. Come tell these dying mothers, as their infants perish at their breasts, that all is well, that their suffering serves some greater good. The poem's fury was almost physical. Voltaire did not argue against optimism so much as he howled at it. The poem shook European intellectual circles, but Voltaire was not finished. For 3 years he refined his rage into something sharper. In 1759, he published a short novel titled Candide, or Optimism. It remains one of the most savage works of satire ever written. The novel follows a young man named Candide, raised in a German castle by his tutor, Dr. Pangloss. Pangloss teaches Leibnizian optimism with absolute conviction. Everything happens for the best in this best of all possible worlds. Every apparent evil serves a hidden purpose. Cause and effect link together in perfect chains. Suffering is an illusion born of limited perspective. Pangloss delivers these pronouncements with unshakable confidence, even as catastrophe after catastrophe destroys everyone around him. Voltaire subjects his characters to every horror imaginable. Candide is thrown out of his castle, pressed into military service, forced to run a gauntlet that nearly kills him, shipwrecked, robbed, and betrayed. He witnesses an earthquake clearly modelled on Lisbon's, complete with the subsequent auto da fe, where the Inquisition burns heretics, supposedly to prevent future earthquakes through divine appeasement. Everywhere Candide goes, he finds suffering, war, slavery, rape, torture, disease, poverty, and everywhere, Pangloss insists that this is the best possible arrangement. The character of Pangloss is Voltaire's masterpiece of mockery. The name itself is Greek for all tongue, suggesting someone who talks constantly but says nothing. Pangloss contracts syphilis and loses an eye and an ear. He explains this as necessary to the chain of causation, since Columbus's voyage to America, which brought back syphilis, also brought back chocolate. Therefore his disfigurement is justified. He is hanged by the Inquisition but survives. He is sold into slavery. At every stage he continues explaining how this particular arrangement of suffering serves the greater good. His explanations become increasingly absurd, increasingly detached from the screaming reality around him. What makes Candide so devastating is not just its catalogue of horrors, but its relentless exposure of optimism's obscenity. Voltaire does not argue that Leibniz's logic is flawed. He shows that the logic, however internally consistent, becomes monstrous when applied to actual suffering. When Pangloss lectures about metaphysical necessity, while people burn to death, philosophy reveals itself as a kind of violence, a refusal to see what stands before your eyes. The novel ends without resolution. Candide and his companions settle on a small farm outside Constantinople. They have lost almost everything. The world has revealed itself as brutal and indifferent. Pangloss still occasionally mutters about the best of possible worlds, but no one listens anymore. When he tries once more to explain how their sufferings fit into a grand design, Candide cuts him off with the novel's most famous line: "We must cultivate our garden, not optimism, not theodicy, not grand explanations, just modest work in a small plot of ground, tending what you can reach." Voltaire killed philosophical optimism as a respectable position. After Candide, no serious thinker could repeat Leibniz's formulas without sounding like Pangloss. The earthquake had posed a challenge. Voltaire's response transformed that challenge into an indictment. The problem of evil was no longer just an intellectual puzzle to solve with sufficient ingenuity. It became a wound in European consciousness, a recognition that suffering exists on a scale that mocks explanation. But something else happened in this transformation. The problem shifted from theology to something darker and more modern. If God could not be reconciled with Lisbon's ruins, perhaps God was not the sort of being philosophers had imagined. Perhaps God was limited, or indifferent, or absent. Perhaps the question was not how to justify divine permission of suffering, but how to live in a universe where suffering requires no justification, because nothing is watching, nothing is judging, nothing cares. The shift was not immediate, but it began here, in the rubble of Lisbon and the pages of Candide. Philosophy was starting to imagine a world without divine purposes, a world where evil was not a problem to solve, but simply a fact to endure. Voltaire dismantled Leibniz's system with ridicule, but ridicule is not a solution. The question remained, now stripped of its comfortable answers, and a Scottish philosopher was already sharpening the most devastating critique yet written. David Hume had no intention of starting a religious war. He had watched what happened to philosophers who questioned divine providence too loudly, and he possessed a temperament that preferred quiet dinners with friends to public controversy, so he wrote his most devastating attack on theodicy in dialogue form, a conversation among three fictional characters that could be dismissed as mere literary exercise if necessary, and he instructed his publisher not to release it until after his death. The dialogues concerning natural religion appeared in 1779, 3 years after Hume died peacefully in Edinburgh at age 65. By then he was beyond the reach of outraged clergymen and angry mobs. The book could speak for itself. The caution was warranted. What Hume had written was not merely skeptical but surgical. Where Voltaire had mocked Leibniz with satirical exaggeration, Hume dismantled every major theodicy with calm, relentless logic. He gave readers no comfortable position to occupy. The dialogue format itself was strategic. 3 characters debating the nature of God, each representing a different philosophical stance, allowing Hume to explore arguments from multiple angles without committing himself to any single voice. But readers then and now have recognized that Philo, the skeptical interrogator, speaks closest to Hume's own convictions. Philo does not rage against God or mock believers. He simply asks questions and follows their implications wherever they lead, even when they lead to conclusions that nobody wanted to reach. The structure of the dialogues turns traditional theodicy inside out. Most theological defenses of divine goodness begin by assuming God exists with certain attributes and then attempt to explain how evil fits into that framework. Hume reverses the procedure. He asks if we observe the world as it actually is, what conclusions about its creator, if any, seem reasonable. The shift seems subtle but proves devastating. Instead of defending God against the problem of evil, Hume treats the existence and nature of God as hypotheses to be tested against the evidence of observable reality. And when you approach the question this way, the world we actually inhabit looks nothing like what an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly benevolent designer would create. Philo begins gently. He grants, for the sake of argument, that the universe shows signs of design. Perhaps some intelligence shaped the natural world. But what kind of intelligence? Here the argument from design, which theologians had wielded for centuries as proof of God's existence, becomes a weapon against traditional theology. If we judge the creator by the creation, as the design argument insists we must, then the creator appears remarkably limited in power, knowledge, or goodness. The world contains a mixture of pleasure and pain, order and chaos, beauty and horror. This mixture suggests 4 possibilities, none of them comforting to orthodox believers. First possibility: the creator has opposed principles at work, one good and one evil, struggling for dominance. This revives the ancient Manichaean dualism that Augustine spent his life refuting, but Hume points out that it fits the observable evidence better than monotheism does. The world looks exactly like what you would expect from competing forces of creation and destruction, not from a single benevolent will. Second possibility: the creator is indifferent to good and evil, a cosmic architect concerned only with structural integrity, not with the happiness or suffering of conscious beings. This fits the evidence even better. The universe appears designed for stability and continuation, not for joy. Third possibility: the creator is learning, experimenting, improving through trial and error. Perhaps our world is an early draft, a practice attempt by an inexperienced deity. Fourth possibility, which Hume does not state directly but allows readers to infer: perhaps the universe requires no conscious creator at all, only natural principles that generate order without intention. None of these possibilities support traditional theology. Each one contradicts at least one of the 3 divine attributes that Epicurus identified as incompatible with evil. An indifferent creator lacks perfect goodness, a struggling creator lacks omnipotence, an experimenting creator lacks omniscience, and a universe without a creator eliminates all 3 attributes along with the deity itself. Hume does not insist on any single conclusion. He simply demonstrates that the world as we observe it provides no clear evidence for the God that theodicy attempts to defend. The argument becomes sharper when Philo considers specific features of existence that any benevolent designer could have improved. Why does the world contain far more pain than necessary for any plausible moral or educational purpose? Why do animals suffer? This question proves particularly devastating to theodicy. The free will defense, which Augustine pioneered, and which still provides the foundation for most Christian responses to evil, explains moral evil by reference to human choice. God gave humans free will, the argument goes, and humans misuse that freedom, creating sin and suffering. Whatever you think of this explanation for human cruelty, it says nothing about earthquakes, diseases, parasites, or the gazelle torn apart by lions. Animals have no free will to misuse. They commit no sins requiring punishment. Their suffering serves no educational purpose because they cannot learn moral lessons. Yet the natural world teems with sentient creatures whose lives consist largely of fear, hunger, pain, and violent death. Hume lingers on animal suffering because it exposes the inadequacy of every major theodicy. These creatures did not fall from grace. They were created as they are. If they were created at all, their pain is not punishment for sin, but part of the ordinary functioning of nature. A God who designed lions to eat gazelles, parasitic wasps to lay eggs inside living caterpillars, diseases to ravage bodies, and earthquakes to crush cities, cannot be absolved by reference to human free will or original sin. Either such a God chose to create a world structured around suffering, or such a God lacks the power to create anything better, or such a God does not exist. No fourth option presents itself. The character Cleanthes, who defends religious orthodoxy in the dialogues, offers various responses. Perhaps animal pain is less intense than human pain. Perhaps the suffering serves purposes we cannot perceive. Perhaps the overall balance remains positive despite individual agonies. Philo dismantles each defense with patient clarity. We have no reason to believe animal pain is less real than ours. The hypothesis of hidden purposes becomes unfalsifiable and therefore explains nothing. And the claim that good outweighs evil in the total cosmic balance is both unverifiable and morally obscene when applied to specific instances of torture or agonizing death. You cannot tell the gazelle being eaten alive that its suffering is acceptable because somewhere else other creatures are experiencing pleasure. You cannot tell the child dying of bone cancer that the cosmic ledger balances out. Theodicy requires precisely this kind of moral accounting, and Hume demonstrates why such accounting fails both logically and ethically. The deeper problem which runs beneath all of Philo's specific arguments is epistemological. The theodicy assumes we can know God's purposes, or at least that we can know those purposes are good even when they appear evil. But this assumption contradicts the enormous gap between human and divine understanding that theology itself insists upon. If God's ways are truly inscrutable, then we cannot use the fact of evil to argue against God's goodness, but neither can we use any observed feature of the world to argue for God's goodness. The design argument and theodicy depend on the same premise that we can infer divine attributes from worldly evidence. Hume accepts that premise and follows it to its logical conclusion. The world we observe suggests, if anything, a limited or indifferent creator, not the God of traditional theology. Hume never claims to have disproven God's existence. He claims something more unsettling, that the problem of evil cannot be solved by rational argument, and attempts to solve it make the theological position worse, not better. Every theodicy either contradicts observable reality or redefines God's attributes in ways that empty them of meaning. To say that God is good, but his goodness differs totally from human goodness, is to drain the word of content. To say that God's purposes are inscrutable is to abandon the claim that we can justify his permission of evil. The only intellectually honest positions, according to Philo, are either frank skepticism about God's existence or a retreat into pure faith that acknowledges its own lack of rational foundation. What you cannot do, what Hume demonstrates you absolutely cannot do, is construct a logical theodicy that preserves both divine perfection and observable reality. The two will not fit together no matter how you arrange them. The dialogues end ambiguously, with each character maintaining his position but none declaring victory. Hume understood that philosophical arguments rarely change minds on matters of faith. People believe or disbelieve for reasons deeper than logic, and theodicy matters more for emotional consolation than intellectual consistency. But he had accomplished his purpose. He had shown that the problem of evil resists every attempted solution, that the explanations theologians offer create new difficulties rather than resolving old ones, and that honesty requires either admitting the problem has no answer or abandoning the conception of God that generates the problem in the first place. Hume left the problem unsolved because he believed it was unsolvable, but philosophy continued, and so did suffering. The question took on new urgency in the 19th century through the voice of a Russian novelist who made the problem unbearably personal. Fyodor Dostoevsky published the final installment of The Brothers Karamazov in November of 1880, just 3 months before his death. The novel appeared in serial form across 2 years, each chapter arriving like a letter from someone who understood suffering from the inside. Dostoevsky had faced a firing squad at age 28, received a last-minute reprieve, spent 4 years in a Siberian labor camp, buried his first wife and his 3-month-old son, battled epilepsy and gambling addiction, and lived much of his life crushed by debt. When he wrote about suffering, he wrote as someone who had counted its cost in ways most philosophers never would. The Brothers Karamazov is many things: a murder mystery, a family drama, a theological epic, but buried in its middle section is a chapter that functions as pure philosophy, as rigorous and devastating as anything Hume ever wrote, compressed into the voice of a fictional character who may be the most compelling atheist in all of literature. Ivan Karamazov is the intellectual of the 3 brothers, the one who left their provincial town for university, who writes articles about church and state, who thinks in systems and arguments. He returns home just as the family tensions are reaching their breaking point, and in a tavern one afternoon, he sits with his younger brother Alyosha, a novice monk, and explains why he cannot accept the world as God has made it. The chapter is called Rebellion. It contains no violence, no dramatic action. 2 brothers sit together while one speaks and the other listens. But what Ivan says has troubled readers for nearly a century and a half, because it shifts the problem of evil from a logical puzzle to a moral accusation. Ivan does not begin with philosophy. He begins with evidence, a catalogue of suffering assembled with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. But Ivan is particular about his evidence. He tells Elisha he could speak of adult suffering, of wars and prisons and cruelty between grown people who have made choices and bear some responsibility for the world they inhabit. But that is not where he directs his attention. Ivan speaks only of children. He has collected stories, clipped from newspapers, remembered from conversations. A 5-year-old girl beaten by her parents, locked in a freezing outhouse all night, crying to dear kind God to protect her. An 8-year-old boy who threw a stone and injured the paw of a general's favourite hunting dog, stripped naked and made to run while the hounds were set upon him, torn to pieces in front of his mother. A Turkish soldier in Bulgaria, amusing himself by shooting infants point blank while their mothers watched. Ivan recites these accounts with terrible calm, his voice never rising, each detail selected for maximum effect. Why children? Ivan is explicit about this. Children have not yet had time to corrupt themselves with the compromises and cruelties of adult life. They have done nothing to deserve punishment. They cannot be held responsible for original sin or the consequences of free will, exercised before they were born. If you want to test whether suffering can be justified, children are the hardest case. They strip away every easy explanation. You cannot say they are being punished for their sins when they have not lived long enough to sin. You cannot say their suffering builds character when they die before they have a chance to develop any. You cannot say they chose this through free will when they never consented to exist at all. The 19th century sentimentalized children in ways earlier ages had not. Childhood became understood as a distinct phase of life, innocent and precious, deserving of protection. Ivan uses this cultural shift as a weapon. He knows his listeners, knows what will wound them most deeply. He selects his examples with the care of someone who understands that philosophy is not just about logic, but about what human beings can bear to accept. And then Ivan makes his move, the one that elevates this from vivid storytelling to philosophical argument. He tells Alyosha that he understands all the theodicies. He has read the books. He knows about free will and the greater good and the necessity of evil for the existence of virtue. He even grants, for the sake of argument, that it might all be true. Perhaps there is some grand harmony waiting at the end of time when all will be revealed and justified, when the mother will embrace the man who set dogs upon her son and forgive him, when every cruelty will be explained as a necessary note in a cosmic symphony. Perhaps in eternity, every tear will be accounted for, and every agony will make sense. Ivan says he does not want it. This is the term that makes rebellion more than a recitation of horrors. Ivan is not arguing that theodicy fails logically. He is saying that even if it succeeds, even if there is a perfect explanation for every instance of suffering, even if it all works out in the end, he refuses to accept it. He does not want a world where the torture of children is the price of admission to eternal harmony. He does not want a heaven built on such a foundation. The image he uses is precise. He respectfully returns his ticket, not because the show will be bad, but because the entrance fee is too high. This move transforms the problem of evil from an intellectual puzzle into a moral protest. The question is no longer whether God's ways can be justified to human reason. The question is whether they should be accepted even if they can. Ivan introduces the possibility that a theodicy might work as logic and still fail as morality. You might prove that God is justified and still conclude that such a God does not deserve worship. You might demonstrate that the universe makes sense and still refuse to participate in it. Philosophers had spent centuries trying to explain suffering in ways that would reconcile it with divine goodness. Ivan suggests that the very attempt is obscene. Some things should not be reconciled. Some injustices should not be explained away. The proper response to the suffering of children is not justification but rage. Alyosha's response matters here. Alyosha is the believer, the gentle one, the future saint. When Ivan finishes, Alyosha does not offer arguments. He does not cite scripture or theology. He says quietly that there is one being who can forgive everything because he gave his innocent blood for all and for everything. He means Christ. But even this Ivan has anticipated, and he responds with another story, The Grand Inquisitor, a parable within the novel that occupies its own chapter, and asks whether Christ himself would be welcome in the world his church has built. But in the moment after Ivan's speech, Alyosha's initial response is not argument but presence. He leans forward and kisses his brother gently on the lips. It is a gesture, not a rebuttal, an acknowledgement that some things cannot be answered, only endured, a recognition that Ivan's protest comes from love, not from hatred of God or humanity, but from a fierce refusal to pretend that suffering does not matter as much as it does. Dostoevsky gives Ivan the stronger arguments. This has troubled some readers who see Dostoevsky as a Christian writer and expect the believer to triumph. But Dostoevsky understood that easy victories prove nothing. He gave Ivan the best case possible because he took the problem seriously. He knew that faith tested by weak objections is not faith at all, and he knew something else, that the intellectual problem and the lived experience of suffering are not the same question. You can resolve the logic and still be left with grief. You can explain everything and comfort no one. Rebellion is only one chapter in a very long novel. The brothers Karamazov continues for hundreds more pages through murder and trial and spiritual crisis. Some readers find answers in the later chapters, in the teachings of the elder Zosima, or the redemption arc of Dmitri or Alyosha's speech to the boys at the novel's end. Others feel that Ivan's questions hang in the air, never quite answered, only surrounded by other voices offering not refutation but alternatives. What makes Ivan's rebellion so enduring is that it speaks to something that had been building through the centuries as theodicy grew more elaborate and more abstract. Augustine spoke of privation of good. Aquinas built intricate systems of cause and effect. Leibniz calculated across infinite possible worlds. Each answer grew more philosophically sophisticated and further from the reality of a child crying in the dark. Ivan dragged the question back to earth. He insisted that if your explanation requires you to accept the torture of innocence as reasonable, then your explanation has failed, no matter how logically tight it may be. Philosophy had treated the problem of evil as a question to be solved, even treated it as an injustice to be named. The shift is subtle but profound. One approach seeks understanding, the other demands accountability. One assumes the world makes sense if only we were smart enough to grasp it. The other insists that some things should not make sense, that the appropriate response to certain horrors is not explanation but refusal. This is why rebellion resonates with readers who may not share Dostoevsky's faith or Ivan's particular concerns. The move Ivan makes, the respectful returning of the ticket, the moral protest against a universe that demands such prices, speaks to anyone who has ever felt that the world as it is violates the world as it should be. It is less an atheist argument than a humanist one. It insists that suffering matters more than systems, that persons are not raw material for cosmic purposes, that there are limits to what should be sacrificed even for the highest goods. Ivan's rebellion was fiction, but the suffering he described was real. The 20th century would bring horrors that made even Dostoevsky's darkest imaginings seem restrained. The camps were liberated in 1945. The photographs arrived shortly after, piles of emaciated bodies, walking skeletons behind barbed wire, ovens designed for industrial-scale murder. 6 million Jews dead, millions of others. The machinery of extermination had been thorough, bureaucratic, almost banal in its efficiency. Philosophers and theologians, who had spent careers constructing elegant theodicies, found themselves staring at images that made every previous answer seem grotesque. This was not suffering that could be explained through free will or soul-making or the greater good. This was suffering designed, administered, perfected. Children had been sorted on railway platforms, left alive, or sent immediately to gas chambers based on arbitrary measurements. Families had been destroyed with the systematic precision of accountants balancing ledgers. The Holocaust was not natural disaster or tragic accident or even ordinary human cruelty amplified. It was evil as industrial process, suffering as state policy, death as logistical achievement. The scale alone defied comprehension. 6 million is not a number the human mind can hold, but the systematic nature cut deeper. The Nazis had kept records. They had allocated resources. They had improved efficiency. They had turned mass murder into a problem of transportation and fuel costs. Auschwitz had not happened in a frenzy of rage or passion. It had happened in meetings, on schedules, with paperwork. For Jewish theologians especially, the question became unbearable. Where had God been? The covenant between God and the Jewish people was supposed to mean something. The promises in Scripture were supposed to count. But if those promises meant anything, what had happened in the camps? And if they meant nothing, what remained of faith itself? Hans Jonas, who had fled Germany in 1933 and lost his mother at Auschwitz, delivered a lecture in 1984 titled "The Concept of God After Auschwitz." His answer was radical. God is not omnipotent. God cannot intervene. Jonas proposed that in the act of creation, God withdrew, contracted, limited divine power to make room for the universe to exist. This Kabbalistic concept, called Tzimtzum, meant that God had chosen to become vulnerable. The universe operated according to its own laws, and human beings possessed genuine freedom. God could not stop the Holocaust because God had surrendered the power to stop it. This was not traditional theology. It violated centuries of teaching about divine omnipotence. But Jonas argued that after Auschwitz, traditional theology had forfeited its credibility. Better an honest admission of divine limitation than elaborate justifications that insulted the dead. Better a God who suffers alongside humanity than a God who permits atrocity for mysterious reasons we are told to trust. Richard Rubinstein went further. In his 1966 book After Auschwitz, he declared that the traditional God of history, the God who acts in the world, who keeps covenants and punishes and rewards, was dead. Not metaphorically dead, but actually dead, at least as a concept that retained any meaning. Auschwitz had demonstrated conclusively that no such God existed. To continue believing in a God who guided history required believing that the Holocaust served some divine purpose, and that belief was morally monstrous. Rubinstein did not become an atheist exactly. He retained a sense of the sacred, a mystical connection to existence itself, but the personal God of biblical religion, the God who heard prayers and intervened in human affairs, that God could not be salvaged. The covenant was broken not by human sin, but by divine absence. Jewish identity and practice could continue, but they had to be reimagined without the old theological foundations. These were not comfortable positions. They offered no consolation. They resolved no contradictions. They simply acknowledged that something had shattered. Many believers rejected Jonas and Rubinstein as giving up too easily, surrendering to despair. But for those who had survived the camps or lost families in them, the old answers felt obscene. To say that Auschwitz served a greater good, that it refined souls or tested faith or fit into a cosmic plan, was to participate retroactively in the crime. The Christian theologian Marilyn McCord Adams, writing decades later in her 1999 book Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God, tried to articulate what made certain kinds of suffering different. She introduced the concept of horrendous evils, suffering so extreme that it destroys the possibility of finding meaning in one's life. Not just bad things, not just tragic things, but things so devastating that they render a person's existence a curse rather than a blessing. Adams was thinking of the Holocaust, of brutal torture, of profound betrayal and violation. She was thinking of suffering that broke people not temporarily but permanently. Traditional theodicy had always assumed that suffering could be integrated into a meaningful life story, that it could be endured and overcome, or at least accepted. But horrendous evil made that integration impossible. How does a mother find meaning after watching her children murdered? How does meaning survive the camps? Adams argued that only a specific kind of redemption could answer horrendous evil, not justification but transformation, not explanation but mystical union with God, that somehow defeated suffering, not by explaining it, but by overwhelming it with a good so profound that it retroactively changed the meaning of everything that had come before. This was less philosophy than desperate hope, less argument than prayer. She knew it. She offered it anyway. The debate among theologians was fierce. Some argued that any attempt to do theodicy after Auschwitz was itself a form of collaboration with evil, that the proper response was silence or protest, never explanation. Others insisted that abandoning theodicy meant abandoning the search for meaning entirely, leaving humanity alone in a universe of random horror. Both sides had reasons. Neither side won. What emerged instead was a fracture in religious thought. The Holocaust had not disproven God's existence through logic or evidence. It had made certain kinds of God talk feel morally compromised. To speak easily about divine plans or soul-making, or the necessity of freedom, now required navigating around images of children in gas chambers. Some managed it, others could not. The problem of evil had always been abstract for those who constructed theodicies in comfortable studies. After 1945, that abstraction became harder to maintain. The question was no longer whether God and evil could coexist in logical space. The question was whether faith could survive the smell of burning bodies, whether prayer could continue in a world where prayer had echoed unanswered inside cattle cars headed east. Philosophy continued. Theology continued. But something had shifted permanently. The Holocaust had demonstrated that human beings were capable of industrialized evil on a scale previously unimagined, and that whatever God might be, divine intervention was not among the reliable features of the universe. Theodicy had to proceed, if it proceeded at all, without the comfortable assumption that suffering had limits or that history bent toward justice. But even as theology struggled with mass atrocity, academic philosophy was refining the problem with new logical tools. The debate was about to become more technical and in some ways more abstract than ever before. By the middle of the 20th century, the problem of evil had been debated for more than 2,000 years, and yet no answer had satisfied everyone. Theologians offered theodicies, novelists wrote protests, survivors bore witness to horrors that made explanation seem obscene. Then, in 1955, the same year that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, an Australian philosopher named John Leslie Mackie published a paper that tried to settle the question once and for all. The title was direct: Evil and Omnipotence. The thesis was devastating. Belief in an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God was not just difficult to defend, it was logically contradictory. Mackey's argument stripped away all theological subtlety and focused on pure logic. If God is omnipotent, he can do anything. If God is omniscient, he knows everything. If God is perfectly good, he wants to eliminate evil, yet evil exists. These four propositions, Mackey claimed, cannot all be true at the same time. One of them must be false. Either God lacks power, or God lacks knowledge, or God lacks goodness, or evil does not actually exist. But since evil plainly does exist, theists face an impossible choice: abandon one of the divine attributes, or abandon logic itself. This was not a new objection. Epicurus had raised essentially the same challenge 2 millennia earlier, but Mackey gave it new force by framing it in the language of formal logic, the same rigorous system used to prove mathematical theorems. He was not making a psychological claim about what seems plausible or emotionally satisfying. He was making a logical claim: the existence of evil is strictly incompatible with the traditional conception of God, in the same way that a square circle is impossible. No amount of faith, no clever theological maneuver could overcome this fundamental incoherence. The response came from an unexpected quarter. Alvin Plantinga was an American philosopher working at Calvin College in Michigan, a small Christian liberal arts school far from the prestigious universities where most major philosophical work was done. He was not interested in defending elaborate theodicies that explained why God permits suffering. He had a narrower goal: to show that Mackey was simply wrong about the logic. Theism might be false, but it was not self-contradictory. Plantinga's response, developed through the 1960s and published in full in his 1974 book, God, Freedom and Evil, used the technical machinery of possible world semantics. This philosophical framework, originally developed for modal logic, imagines all the different ways reality could have been. Some possible worlds contain talking dolphins, some contain no suffering at all, some are almost identical to ours except that you chose tea instead of coffee this morning. God, being omnipotent, can actualize any possible world. But here was Plantinga's crucial move: not every possible world is actualizable by God, if that world contains creatures with genuine free will. Free will, Plantinga argued, is valuable enough that a world containing free creatures is better than a world of mere automatons, even if those automatons never do wrong. But if creatures are truly free, then their choices are not determined by God. God can create free beings and place them in favorable circumstances, but he cannot guarantee that they will always choose good without removing their freedom entirely. It is logically possible, Plantinga suggested, that every possible world containing free creatures who do significant good also contains free creatures who sometimes do significant evil. If this is true, then God faces no contradiction in creating such a world. The evil results not from any limitation in God's power or goodness, but from the logical structure of freedom itself. This argument became known as the free will defense, though Plantinga insisted it was a defense, not a theodicy. He was not claiming this is why God actually permits evil. He was only showing that Mackey's charge of logical inconsistency fails. If the free will defense is even possibly true, then theism is not logically incoherent. Most philosophers, even many who remained atheists, eventually conceded that Plantinga had succeeded on his own terms. The logical problem of evil, as Mackey formulated it, was generally considered solved. But solving a logical puzzle is not the same as addressing the real anguish of the question, and even Plantinga's defense left enormous difficulties untouched. It might account for moral evil, the wrong that humans freely choose, but what about natural evil? What about earthquakes, diseases, childhood cancers? Plantinga suggested that fallen angels with free will might be responsible for natural evils, but this seemed to many critics like an ad hoc addition, multiplying invisible agents to protect a theory. More fundamentally, the free will defense did nothing to explain why the world contains so much evil, so much seemingly pointless suffering. Perhaps the existence of some evil is compatible with God's existence. But this much evil? This intensity and distribution of pain? This concern led to a reformulation of the problem. In 1979, the philosopher William Rowe published The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism, which shifted the debate from logical inconsistency to evidential challenge. Rowe granted Plantinga's point. Theism might be logically consistent, but logical consistency is not enough. The question is whether the actual pattern of suffering we observe in the world makes God's existence probable or improbable. Rowe's argument turned on specific cases. He asked readers to imagine a faun trapped in a forest fire, dying slowly over several days in terrible agony, unseen by any human, or consider a 5-year-old girl brutally beaten and sexually assaulted, then murdered. These things happen. They happen frequently. Can anyone seriously believe that such suffering is necessary for some greater good? Can anyone identify what good could possibly require a faun's drawn-out death in a burning forest? The power of Rowe's argument lay in its modesty. He was not claiming to prove that no greater good could justify such suffering. He was claiming only that we cannot see what that good might be, and that our inability to see it, despite serious reflection, gives us good reason to believe no such good exists. This is not deductive proof. It is evidential reasoning, the same kind we use in ordinary life when we conclude that, because we cannot find our keys after a thorough search, they are probably not in the house. Defenders of theism responded in various ways. Some argued that human beings with our limited perspective are simply not in a position to judge what goods might require such suffering. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. We are like small children who cannot understand why the surgeon must cut into our flesh, who scream and resist what is ultimately for our benefit. This response, however, struck many as a retreat into inscrutability. If we truly cannot judge whether any particular suffering is justified, then we also cannot judge whether any act is genuinely evil. The whole moral structure of theism seems to depend on our having some reliable moral knowledge. Others developed what became known as skeptical theism, arguing more carefully that the gap between divine and human knowledge is large enough that we should expect not to see the reasons for many of God's permissions. We know there are goods we cannot conceive, just as a medieval peasant could not conceive of the goods of modern medicine. Our inability to imagine what good requires the faun's suffering is not strong evidence that no such good exists. Rowe found this response worth taking seriously, though he ultimately remained unconvinced. The debate became a careful weighing of probabilities and epistemic principles, conducted in academic journals with increasing technical sophistication. This technical debate mattered. It clarified what was at stake, separated distinct questions that had been conflated, and showed precisely where disagreement remained. But something was lost in the refinement. The problem of evil began as a cry of pain and protest. It asked how we can believe in goodness when confronted with Auschwitz, with dying children, with the faun burning in the forest. The academic debate about possible worlds and epistemic probability, for all its precision, risked becoming an intellectual game played at a safe distance from real suffering. Even Karamazov's rebellion, his refusal to accept any cosmic harmony built on tortured children, could not be answered by modal logic. The technical sophistication of late 20th century philosophy of religion advanced our understanding of what kind of problem this is. But it did not, perhaps could not, touch the deeper question, not whether theism is logically or probabilistically defensible, but whether any explanation, any justification, any theodicy could ever be enough. These philosophical refinements advanced the debate, but they did not settle it. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps the problem of evil is less a puzzle to solve than a reality to endure. The technical debate between Mackie and Plantinga represented philosophy at its most refined, but also at its most remote from the original anguish that sparked the question. Somewhere between the logical symbols and the possible world semantics, the dying child stopped crying and became a variable in an equation. This is not a criticism exactly. Precision has its place, and clarity matters. But the persistence of the problem of evil across 3,000 years suggests that no amount of logical refinement will ever fully resolve it. The question endures not because philosophers have failed to think clearly, but because clarity itself cannot bridge the gap between what reason can accept and what conscience can bear. Consider the simple fact that every major theodicy in history has convinced some people while leaving others cold. Augustine's privation theory satisfied medieval theologians for centuries, but sounds like word games to modern ears. How does calling evil an absence make the presence of suffering any less real? Leibniz's best of all possible worlds pleased rationalists who loved systematic completeness, but struck Voltaire as obscene. Planting as free will defense works logically, granting every premise, accepting every inference, and still many philosophers walk away thinking something essential has been evaded. The problem is not that these theodicies fail as philosophy. The problem is that they succeed as philosophy, while failing as consolation. This reveals something important about the nature of the question itself. The problem of evil presents itself as a logical puzzle, how to reconcile three propositions that seem incompatible. But embedded within that logical structure is a deeper question about meaning. When Ivan Karamazov catalogues the torture of children, he is not simply pointing out a logical inconsistency in the divine attributes. He is protesting that the universe as constructed makes no moral sense. His rebellion is not against God's logic, but against God's priorities. Even if a theodicy demonstrates that evil serves some greater good, Ivan's response remains, then the price is too high, the system is rigged, and I want no part of it. This is why theodicy always feels like it is playing defense. The believer attempts to show that God's goodness remains intact despite appearances, but the very need for this defense concedes that appearances are damning. The world looks exactly as it would look if there were no benevolent overseer, or if that overseer were indifferent, or if divine goodness meant something utterly alien to human morality. Theodicy tries to explain why this appearance deceives us, but the explanations never quite overcome the weight of that initial observation. Children die of bone cancer. Earthquakes kill 30,000 people at prayer. The innocent suffer while the guilty prosper. These facts sit there, unbudgeable, and all the philosophical architecture built around them cannot make them feel less heavy. What makes the problem even stranger is that it persists long after belief in the traditional God has faded. You do not need to believe in an omnipotent creator to feel the force of the question. Strip away the theology entirely, and a secular version of the problem remains: why does undeserved suffering exist in a universe that contains conscious beings capable of recognizing injustice? This is no longer about reconciling divine attributes. This is about whether existence itself is fundamentally absurd, whether morality is just a human invention projected onto an indifferent cosmos, whether the recognition that things should be otherwise has any grounding beyond our own preferences. The atheist confronting horrendous evil faces a different problem than the believer, but no less troubling. The believer must explain why God permits suffering. The atheist must explain why suffering feels like it should not exist. If the universe is genuinely indifferent, if there is no cosmic justice, no ultimate meaning, no providential order, then suffering just is. It requires no justification because there is no judge to justify it to. The fawn dies in the forest fire. The child dies of disease. These events simply occur, neither good nor bad in themselves, painful only to the degree that certain nervous systems register pain. And yet this description feels inadequate, even obscene. Something in human consciousness rebels against pure naturalism's account of suffering just as fiercely as Ivan rebels against divine theodicy. Perhaps what both responses share is a recognition that suffering presents a problem of meaning before it presents a problem of logic. The question is not simply whether evil is compatible with God's existence. The question is whether the world makes the kind of sense that would allow moral claims to have weight. When we say that a child's torture is wrong, we seem to be saying more than that we dislike it or that it violates our evolutionary programming. We seem to be saying that reality itself has been violated, that something objectively bad has occurred, that the universe has gone wrong in some fundamental way. But this intuition fits uncomfortably both with traditional theism, which must explain why God allows such violations, and with naturalism, which struggles to ground objective wrongness in a cosmos without inherent purpose. The persistence of the problem across philosophical systems and theological frameworks suggests that we are dealing with something close to a permanent feature of human consciousness. We cannot help but believe that some suffering is genuinely unjust, not merely unfortunate. We cannot stop ourselves from demanding that this injustice be acknowledged, explained, or at minimum not ignored. This is what Ivan's rebellion captures so powerfully. Even if you could prove to him that child torture serves some cosmic good, even if you could demonstrate with flawless logic that this is indeed the best of all possible worlds, he would still refuse to accept it. His refusal is not irrational. His refusal is moral. Some things ought not to be tolerated, even by logic, even by God. This is where theodicy reaches its limit. You can construct ever more sophisticated philosophical systems. You can invoke free will, soul-making, natural law, possible worlds, inscrutability of divine purposes. But at some point, the person asking the question stops asking whether your explanation works and starts asking whether explanation itself is the right response. There is a difference between accounting for evil and responding to it. Theodicy tries to account for evil, to fit it into a larger framework where it makes sense. But perhaps what suffering demands is not explanation but witness, not justification but acknowledgement, not logical resolution but moral refusal to call it acceptable. The problem of evil persists because human beings need the world to make sense, but we also need it to make the right kind of sense. We need morality to be real, justice to be meaningful, compassion to be more than just evolutionary accident. The question of why innocent people suffer forces us to confront whether these needs can be met by any picture of reality we can construct. Theology tried to meet them and created paradoxes. Philosophy tried to meet them and created abstractions. Literature tried to meet them and created tragedies. None of these responses solved the problem, but all of them honored it, refused to dismiss it, insisted that it mattered. Perhaps that insistence is the real answer, or as close to an answer as we can reach. The problem of evil will not be solved tonight, or perhaps ever, but in the asking, something important happens. We insist that suffering matters, that it requires acknowledgement, that the world as it is falls short of the world as it should be.